Yes. So, wait, did you have both teams consented to be filmed for this round?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. As soon as the chairperson has the team's name, we'll begin.
And what? Tomorrow from there.
I will do should I check outside? There's not a space room close to it. Okay, can you please start us off?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this preliminary round of the 2016 World Schools Debating Championship. May I please remind you to turn off all mobile devices so that we aren't disturbed during the debate. Thank you. The motion for today's debate is this House believes that it should be a criminal offense to make comments which could promote hatred against people of particular races, religions, disabilities, sexuality, or gender identities. Debating this round are Team Bangladesh proposing and Team USA opposing. Please welcome them. For side proposition speaking are Warish, Sashid and Wafi. Please welcome them. On side opposition speaking are Milan, Liz and Amit. Our judges for today's debate are Aaron Akash from New Zealand, Anna England Kerr from England, and Petra Poshpi. Sorry, I'm not very good at Czech, and he's from the Czech Republic. The speaking time for each speech is 8 minutes, and the first and the last minute are protected from points of information. After the first and the 7th minute, I will knock on the table so that you know whether points are allowed or not allowed. During the reply speeches, there are no points of information. Now it's my pleasure to welcome Baris to open this debate.
After every single terrorist attack, when individuals of hijabis and Muslims and brown people are forced to endure an outpouring of hate speech and insults against their religion, insults against their race, insults against their country, and they're made to feel inferior, made to feel like they don't belong in their own countries, made to be someone who they aren't, and are forced to prevent their expression of who they are as a human being, we from Team Bangladesh firmly believe that this is something that must be criminalized as far as possible. We tell you this under our model. First, we give you a neutral and international committee to decide on these cases of hate speech, under which, on a second basis, all races, gender identities, religions, and even sects within those religions, such as Sufis, Sunnis, and Shias within Islam, will be properly represented. Third, this will be an international one, devoid of proper equal representation from all countries. Just like other cases, we will have a separate juvenile unit for counseling minors work in this case. Not take it. And finally, we'll have no exclusions whatsoever on who makes his hate speeches. All individuals will be treated equally under this law. I'll talk to you about two things. First, why this fulfills the metrics of criminal justice and therefore it has to be a criminal offense. Two, how it ensures social equality through the law. Sajid will come up and tell you how this breaks the perpetual cycle of hate speech in an individual. First, understand what sort of kind of world are we talking about. We're talking about hate speech, that is generalizations, that is insults, that are based on absolutes about a specific race or specific gender identity. These are not based on well-meaning constructive criticism. We are not talking about well-meaning constructive criticism that is based on empirical data, that doesn't demean and belittle a group, that rather improves and suggests an improvement on the status quo. What do we mean by this? This means we firmly stand against any assertion by any individual who says that people of a certain particular race are all criminals. But we are perfectly okay with defending an individual, pointing out the statistics based on race of crime in those specific areas, and then going on to suggest that something needs to be done to further enfranchise those individuals and bring them into our fold. We firmly stand behind that in our case. Second, who are these people who commit these hate crimes in the first place? These are people who carry out character attacks, who carry out exclusionary, prejudiced statements. These are people who usually tend to come from privileged backgrounds or from majorities who have already had a lot of exposure to the world, but still, even having given the choice and exposure to people of different minorities, still continue to do the hate speech, and they still continue to demean these people. They ignore these other views, and they're shaped by the hateful rhetoric.
So if someone interprets the speech Black Lives Matter that could promote hatred, what happens in your world? How do you decide if it could promote hatred?
That is exactly what we bring under our model. When you have a fair and equally representative model from all different sectors, from all different views and backgrounds, to ensure that there isn't a bias, to ensure that all views are equally represented. We give you the example where this worked perfectly fine in the very safe and tolerant country that this country is built upon. For example, when Germany decides to criminalize hate speech, and it posts a ban after World War II on Nazi rhetoric, on swastikas, and on all sorts of Holocaust denial, because it makes the space unsafe for Jews, because it punishes anti-Semite murders worse than it punishes ordinary murder based on passion and instinct. We give you that this already exists and has worked exceedingly well in the case that we give you. First argument, why the metrics of criminal offense are perfectly justified. We give you the first is that there is an intent to harm. Second, that it causes a harm. And third, it fails your responsibility as a citizen to the state. First, how does it fulfill the intent to harm? Because hatred means you wish harm upon an individual, you wish harm upon a group that you don't like, that you can't stand to see in your society. This means you vilify them. This means you dehumanize them. And you're perfectly fine with not feeling empathy for them in the first place because you dehumanize them to a lower extent and inferior beings through your hate speech, saying that they don't belong. They could have chosen otherwise. They had plenty of exposure in this case. They had plenty of exposure to people of other, but they still intended to do so. On a secondary basis, these are another sort of intent to harm because they intend to make other individuals in society to cause harm in the first place. There's two different levels of harm. In both cases, they want harm to befall these individuals. Therefore, the intent to harm is fully satisfied and this should be punished. Second, what sort of harms does this cause? Understand that through the justice system, your right only extends as far as it doesn't infringe upon another individual's rights. This means, what are the rights that this hate speech infringes? First, it infringes the right of a minority to feel like they belong in a society that they have every right to belong to as much as anyone else. There's no basis on excluding these people simply based on the color of their skin or their ethnicity or their religious beliefs. These people are made to feel that they don't belong. These people can't go out in the street and feel like a German. They can't feel like an American unless they fit with the majority, unless they fit with those people who are making these hate speeches in the first place. It takes away their right to feel like they belong in the society. Second, it takes away their right to security because this makes the spaces that they live in unsafe. This makes them feel like they're constantly under threat, that they might be attacked at any moment. When they get death threats in the letters, when Ayan Hirsi Ali was given death threats in the mail after her writings or after her writings, she was made to feel absolutely unsafe, and this infringed her right as an individual society to feel safe. Third, it infringes their right to freedom of movement because it means they can't freely move around in all sorts of society, but they are restricted into neighborhoods which are majority of their own religion, of their own enclave. This makes them feel that they can't move freely within society itself, which is a fundamental harm, not taken. Finally, it infringes the right to state welfare because it perpetuates images of for example, African Americans living off the welfare system, which makes it far harder to pass legislation that ensures that these individuals have equal access to state welfare. It violates all these cases, and this means, for our sake, and when you violate your responsibility as an ordinary citizen to ensure a safe space for others, to ensure you don't harm others and take away their rights and freedoms, justice must act as an equalizer. Justice must intervene and ensure a level playing field, must ensure that this harm doesn't happen, and therefore they must be punished for taking away other people's rights. This ensures through our model. Second, so our second argument will show you why. Why, apart from the principal justification, we give you that we ensure social equality through the law.
Sir.
The main thing about law is this. It comes from the highest echelons of power. It comes from the state, from the very top-down mechanism towards the people at the bottom. This means there's an intense ideological and symbolic power. The power to change individuals' minds, not taken. This means it has the power to change an individual's mind. There's a power of legitimacy and strength. This means that when this happens, it creates a very important narrative that ensures that the state at least takes a stand against hate speech, at least takes a stand to protect the minorities who deserve it the most. Because that's the least they deserve after these centuries of hatred, after being centuries being made to feel like second-class citizens. Second, what do we do? We suppress that active expression of hatred long enough. What happens? It either dies out from that individual itself, it fails to perpetuate and propagate within society, so it's kept within that individual, it's kept within that for a certain space, and not made to spread forever in society to others. We ensure that they have enough time to be exposed to other views to change their mind in the first place, which wouldn't have happened if they had let the hate speech occur, if they were labeled as a hate speaker, if they have been solidified in their mindset as someone of that ideology. What do? At the very least, we ensure a safer society for the most vulnerable in our society. We ensure that everyone in society is made to feel like they belong. We ensure that you can't take away another person's rights, no matter what your opinion, no matter what you say. We are very proud to stand and propose for this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Varish. The speaking time was 8 minutes and 11 seconds. It's now my pleasure to call Milan, the first speaker of said opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, it seemed like Team Bangladesh wanted to argue the motion, hate speech is bad. But that's not the topic we were given in today's debate. Today's debate, we were arguing whether or not speech that could incite hatred should be criminalized or not. We think they missed the nuances in today's topic when they just assume that we're going to be objectively able to determine what is hatred in all circumstances, particularly when we think that what incites hatred to some people is different than what incites hatred to others. We think the overtly liberal stance they took in today's debate doesn't encapsulate the realities of how this criminalization would work in the real world. With that being said, I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, respond to some of the substantive matter we heard from the proposition. Secondly, go into some framing issues of today's round. And thirdly, present our first 2 substantive arguments. That firstly, we defend the principle of free speech, and secondly, on the practical backlash that would come from this policy. But first, let's begin with the model that we heard from the proposition. Now they talk to you about this international committee that's going to be objectively able to determine what is hate and what is not. We think there's a number of problems with this. First off, we think that when we're talking about criminalization and emotion, it's about an individual state determining what is legal and illegal. We think states don't cede this right to other bodies to determine what should be criminalized or not. That's not how this works in the status quo. But secondly, we think this equal representation which they purport will happen, and we don't think that's really viable. We think even under that circumstances, there's going to be conflicting views in this committee, right? If you have a nationalist white man, they're going to think Black Lives Matter protesters are inciting hatred from their community, while vice versa is true. They can't only say that, oh, the liberal views are the ones that we are going to consider when we're determining what is hatred. Then we think that if there's conflict in the committee and 2 bodies differ, i.e. a Black Lives Matter person within the committee and a white nationalist differ on what is hatred, their committee doesn't function. They don't give us a mechanism for resolving these kind of subjective disputes, which is the problem with hate speech, or in fact what the motion says, what could incite hate speech. Finally, we think that at the end of the day, since the government is the one who's enforcing this criminalization, the bias of the government is always going to be included. This is going to be particularly damaging when we look around the world and see that certain theocracies are the governments who enforce certain laws that are strict due to religion and have biases based on that. So those kinds of governments are going to perceive hate speech differently. I.e., if someone talks badly about a theocratic regime, that could be considered hate speech by the government, who's ultimately going to be enforcing this. We think they provided a model that wasn't actually topical in today's round, and we urge them to actually engage with the motion that was provided with us. But nonetheless, I'm going to engage with their argumentation. Their first argument was on generalizations. And they say, we only support defending against the kind of hate speech that's character attacks. But we think what constitutes a character attack to one person is different than what constitutes a character attack to another, right? If someone says Allahu Akbar and supports their religion, we think that could incite hatred in someone else who is a protester against that specific religion. Even if those individuals in the first place were only fighting for their religious freedom, that still incites hatred among some bodies. That's the issue that we take with them. But then they talk about the intent to harm, right? And this is the problem we take with Bangladesh's case. Because you cannot determine who has an intent to harm or not, right? That's the subjective nature of hate speech. Some people may just be speaking their views and thinking that's what's correct for them. Then then they talk about the impacts here. First on freedom of movement, second on state welfare. The problem is, in the status quo, these kinds of problems already exist, right? Freedom of movement is only accessible to those who are of the hegemonic identity. The white people, not those who are disenfranchised. The issue is, when you take away the ability for these minority groups to protest, i.e. through things like Black Lives Matter, like transgender protests, then they never have the ability to actually gain this kind of capital so they can gain these kinds of impacts. Under their world, you silence these protesters because their things that are considered fighting for rights are considered inciting hatred as well amongst other people. That's the problem with the subjective nature of opposing hate. But then go on to their second argument where they talk about the practical harms. Then let's assume here that they can only target the kind of speech that's going to incite hatred. I'm going to give them a lot of leeway here and take them on their absolute highest ground. Even under that circumstance, the hatred doesn't go away. All you do is push it further down into dissenters, into echo chambers, which only reifies that and creates more backlash in the future, which I'm going to get into my argumentation. Now, 2 points on framing, but first, go ahead.
International pressure means that you're first liable to take a decision, like in the case of punishing murder. But whether you do that by death penalty or by life imprisonment is your duty. But don't you think they should be punished?
Thank you. The problem with his statement is we still consider subjective what to punish or not, right? That's the intention in today's motion. What could incite hatred is different to one person than it is to another. Under that system, they have to defend that we ban all forms of speech that have this potential outcome. With that being said, the first thing is the proposition needs to show you that there's a serious principled reason to violate the freedom of speech, right? Not just that it could be some tangential benefit in the long term, because it is something that we consider a fundamental human dignity. Secondly, they have to defend the effects of criminalizing speech that could promote hatred, not just criminalizing hate speech. This, in the context of how criminalization works in the real world, is how they have to phrase their case in today's debate. First on the principle. We think in today's debate that what constitutes hate speech is particularly subjective, whereas the freedom of speech is objective. This is particularly problematic, given that it's not just objective, like offensive speech that they would censor in the proposition world, but also speech that could be intrinsically valuable to disadvantaged groups. First layer on positive speech. Positive speech that is necessarily beneficial to one individual minority group can still incite hatred from those who are opposing that group. I.e., Black Lives Matter protesters in Brazil or the United States still incite hatred from white supremacists around the world. Transgender advocates promoting gender equality still garner hatred from religious fanatics around the world. They would censor that kind of speech under their world, but here's why that's a problem. Because when we censor all speech across the board, the only kinds of biases that still remain are those by the hegemonic identity. The only way for these kinds of minority groups to challenge these kinds of systemic problems are through protest, which they would say incites hatred under their side of the house. Second layer of analysis on hurting other freedoms. We think something like the freedom of religion, i.e. a Muslim man praying, is considered speaking, and that's considered a comment, but that could incite hatred in a place like populist Europe, where groups consider that as something that causes hatred within their own people. But secondly, we think this is also a violation of protest, and the freedom to protest is an intrinsic check we have on governments. But the issue is, when a government can say, oh, this kind of speech is inciting hatred against the government, well, that's a reason to quash protest, something that we think is damaging, but only occurs in the proposition world. Second argument on backlash. We think that there are people who already believe that the world as it is far too politically correct. This is to say that we are oversensitive on issues of social justice, race, sexual orientation, and religion. These people who perceive their way of life as being criminalized because of the proposition stance is going to think that leaders now are simply saying are going to be pushed further towards leaders who are perceived as telling it as it is. These are people like Donald Trump in the United States and Marine Le Pen in the EU. We think that under this case scenario, the backlash is that now, well, they may not be able to speak their hatred if we grant them all of their ground, but now they push down to doing things like electing individuals who implement policies that are more disenfranchising to these minority groups. But secondly, we think this also works in the event of echo chambers, right? Because if people can't speak their opinions in public anymore, they're only going to talk to those who share the same beliefs as them. I.e., so I go to someone, if I'm a white supremacist, and I talk to another white supremacist, and that only reifies my individual beliefs, right? The problem with that is the hatred doesn't go away, it just further grows to a point where at some point it outbursts into the public eye. They don't eliminate hatred under their side of the house, they just allow it to grow. At the end of the day, we were never debating the motion today, is hate speech a bad thing? They had to defend are all speech that could possibly promote hatred bad. We think Bangladesh didn't meet that burden, and that's why they lost.
Thank you, Milan, for your speech. The speaking time was 8 minutes and 8 seconds. It is now my pleasure to call Sajid, the second speaker of Side Proposition, to give this speech. Please welcome him.
What promotes hatred? It's not praying on the street, because that's just praying. What promotes hatred is actively stating that a particular group of people deserve it. It's actively stating that a group of people do not belong in your society and are different to you, and you should treat them differently. If the opposition model is to defend, if our burden is to defend not allowing Muslims to pray, that's a debate we're never going to win, and that's a burden they can't push onto us, and that's a shameful case from them. We think our model is very clear, ladies and gentlemen. If those are the instances they want to defend their case on, the jury and the model we specifically created cater to those problems. They tell us that the model, firstly, is problematic. We think the model, first, will be composed of state and the people within the state itself. So ideally, every single person within the state or that have a group of people to represent them are involved in that system. But secondly, we don't understand why that system won't work. Similarly, when you allow a jury to decide a verdict, we think this model or this jury can decide what is considered inciting hate. And I'm pretty sure that won't be praying on the street, because that's involving religious practices, not actively telling people that you deserve to hate Muslims.
Sir.
It's very simple. But third, they tell us that international tribunals should not be set up at all. We think that we've clearly responded to that from our first speech, where we first told you that a lot of hate is generated internationally, where there's a lot of global hatred for Israel and what they do to Palestine. There's a lot of global hatred for what Russia did to Crimea. These kinds of issues need an international tribunal. But more importantly, international standards and international pressure ensures proper justice. So they have to defend why that's a bad comparative in their world, something they completely rejected. But their last idea was, look, the bias of the government comes into this. We think that our model specifically is the best model that gets rid of the bias of the government. Because in this instance, it's not the model, it's a model of people that decide what hate speech or inciting hate within people is. It's not the government telling you that you deserve this punishment, but it's rather the people of your country, every single strata, conversing, deciding, and making sure that they objectively create a decision that benefits the society. Something they completely rejected. The next layer of responses was, look, intent in itself is subjective. You could probably intend to do something and you could probably not. First, I think that jury also deals with the intent problem as well, where they can understand the intent of a particular action, where praying does not intend to instill hatred. But secondly, we don't think intent is subjective in a lot of cases. In most cases, intent is direct. Donald Trump stating, Mexicans take American jobs away. Donald Trump stating, there is a problem with Muslims. Marine Le Pen going out front in the National Front of France and saying that you deserve to hate on people that promote free trade. Those are the kinds of things that have an active intent. Firstly, to harm, because you do not instill hate in people without intending to harm them. But secondly, the very fact that you spoke it out to society means you want society to act. If you didn't intend for society to act, you'd keep it to yourself and not converse about it. The action of conversing is an intent for society to act. Something they never responded to. No. But then they tell us, look, minorities protest, and this in general is disempowered. They use the convenient example of Black Lives Matter. Here's a very interesting comparative. Our model is not no protest versus a lot of protest. Our model is constructive protest versus hate protest, ladies and gentlemen. We think constructive protest in itself, one, is the best kind of protest in itself, where you constructively discuss the problems that institutes a certain society or institutes a certain group of people. Something my Prime Minister clearly stated and they failed to analyze. That is the best kind of criticism that, one, never generates hatred and creates an equal society, but two, is likely to reach the most number of people, where Black Lives Matter will gain more traction by not blowing cars up and creating vandalism, but creating peaceful, meaningful understanding of why Detroit is suffering through problems, why Detroit does not have resources, and critically pointing that out without instilling hatred. That's the model we're defending, not one of no protest. But lastly, they tell us, look, there's going to be some kind of backlash because, one, we think Donald Trump, there's going to be backlash if you don't allow Donald Trump to speak out. He will probably force people into electing them into certain positions. Two responses to this. First, we think these kinds of politicians empower themselves by the fact that they create hatred within society. So for him to win the election, he has to create hatred. Same goes for Marine Le Pen, same went for Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand, same goes for the UKIP party in England. We think these sorts of parties have no meaningful meaning in society unless they instill hatred. So their idea of them being able to do something to society internally does not stand. But more importantly, we think that the internal conversation and hate, if that exists, is still better off than a society where Muslims are afraid to go out on the street. It's a society where Detroit is filled with people that are forced into gangs because they're afraid of what it means to come out of Detroit, go into Washington, ladies and gentlemen. That's the kind of society that's created in their world. We defend that. Sure, let them hate these people. That's the worst case. As long as the society is better, we still win this debate because those people live a life of meaning, all the rights that are harmed by them. The freedom of speech argument they want to talk about only stands when all those rights are not infringed. Your right does not supersede the right of all of these people, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to arguments before that. Yeah.
So in your world, you say Black Lives Matter is problematic because they criticize Detroit because other races could consider that as hatred. So you stop those protests because other races think that it's hatred. How do you stop for that subjectivity to become objective? Where is the link analysis?
One, if they actually did instill hatred, there's a jury to decide that. But two, we think Black Lives Matter already work efficiently and will work even better if they carried out constructive criticism process, which we're more than willing to promote. Our burden is not to defend Black Lives Matter, but to defend a world where constructive criticism is promoted without hatred. That's a simple debate. But moving on to constructives, we think hate speech is perpetual, right? Our first speakers already told you how hate speech, or if they don't want to term it as that, how encouraging hate within society is bad for society itself. How you convince society to hate on a particular individual. But it's not just that, right? It's also a perpetual process of how you convince yourself. What do we mean by this? Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, was born in Austria. His initial arguments were about, reintegrating with Germany and how Jewish people were inherently bad. He convinced himself this by continuously debating in parliament and enraging hate within society. What did that eventually lead to? That solidified the rhetoric that he ended up justifying killing Jews, ladies and gentlemen. From a simple hate or enraging of hate of telling people that Jewish people are bad, it eventually lead to justifying killing Jewish people. This in itself means allowing these kinds of things is a perpetual process that eventually leads to something bad. We from Team Government have no problem criminalizing any of this because in principle, ladies and gentlemen, that's a criminal intent and it causes huge amounts of harms to society. But why is this argument important? This argument is important because these individuals are from the upper strata of society that determine how social narratives work. If Hitler took a different narrative at that point in time of Germany, look at what that could mean to the whole world. That could mean that a different narrative of how tolerance and promotion of social equality was a standard set from a long time ago. That's why these individuals are important. And we're more than okay with criminalizing this intent if it means stopping such harms and if it means individuals themselves don't convince themselves of what this harm is. So in conclusion, what have we shown to you? In principle, we meet the criteria of any criminal process. We showed you intent, we showed you action, we showed you how citizens of a country should operate. Second, we talked about a socially cohesive society. And even in the worst case, where the discussions are eternal, we still have a more socially cohesive society. But my argument clearly showed you that even if individuals themselves are bad, this in itself allows them to stop getting worse. We're more than willing to win this debate from Team Bangladesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sajid, for your speech. The speaking time was 8 minutes and 18 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this, the second speaker of side opposition.
I wish today's debate honestly took place in the happy-go-lucky world of the team proposition, where there are certain fundamental truths, like the liberal agenda, that people seem to understand that racism is always bad, or sexism is always bad. But unfortunately, we understand on our side of the house that there are people in power who don't hold those beliefs like you and I do in this community. There are people in power who will use that as a means of violence, the point at which they cede the power to criminalize these acts of quote-unquote hate to the people who do not share these opinions as like you and I do. We say that is net bad, that is not something we ought to do. In this speech, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to continue to deconstruct Team Proposition's case. After that, I'm going to go back to our side of the house, build up our matter, and introduce our third argument, which is criminalizing disproportionately demonizes minorities. But first, let's continue to address Team Proposition's case. First, I'm going to start with the model. Millen gives you 3 pieces of offense on this, none of which corresponded to in the last speech. He tells you, first, the point at which they say the only way to evaluate whether or not something is hate speech is the intent. We say, how can this jury that apparently transcends human understanding in their world potentially evaluate the intent of someone's actions? Secondly, we say that even if in some suspension of our knowledge, suspension of our knowledge, we say they can. We say the point at which they cede the enforcement of the criminalization, which they don't actually talk about, to the individual state, States, they say that even if we arrive at some conclusion being bad, the individual state can enforce that. So if the state is racist, they're going to enforce the policies in a way that is discriminatory and bad. They don't deal with that. Third, we tell you that they have no mechanism by which to resolve conflicts within this jury that they talk about. We say that when people come from different parts of the world, there's no way to objectively come at these truths that they're talking about. There's no reconciliation. We can't imagine what the world of the proposition looks like. And the point at which Millen, in his last speech, is able to cast doubt onto the model of team proposition, we say that they are not holding up their burden in this speech. The first argument is this idea of the principle, and we give you some responses onto this too. First, we say principally that speech is intrinsically good, but speech is objectively good in that sense because it promotes discourse. The point is, when you allow the interpretation of that speech to go to the people who are in power, they take their biases to make that speech subjective. That's the distinction we give you. So we don't defend free speech in the absolute, but what we're telling you is that when people in power can misconstrue that free speech as a means of using violence, that's an issue. This motion is conveniently worded in that it doesn't say hate speech in it. It says things which could intend to cause hate. So they have to defend the instances not just in which things actually do cause hate, but also the instances in which they could, the point at which they cede the power to determine that to states which we believe have their biases. That's bad, and that results in material harm. That's the principle. The second argument they tell you on their side of the house is the practical. So I'm going to do some examples to deconstruct this. We are not saying by any stretch of the imagination that Muslims shouldn't be allowed to pray in public. No, that's not the argument that we're making. But the argument that we're making is, imagine a world in which, for example, Donald Trump is the president of the United States and their jury has ceded the power to criminalize who is actually causing things to incite hate to him. The point at which that power is ceded to him, he can say, oh, that Muslim man praying in public or simply just being Muslim is inciting hate within the United States, and we have to criminalize him. But the point at which in their model, there's no enforcement mechanism. They just assume that these things are going to happen. We say they're providing no causal links in any of their arguments. They're just jumping from A to Z, kind of like in their third argument, where they say that because Hitler was able to actually talk in front of parliaments, that suddenly caused the Holocaust. We say that there's no causal link in this instance, and there were a lot of other situations in which these things happened. We say that when you actually allow and cede the power to the state, which we believe is problematic, that's where you get issues. On team opposition side of the house, I'm going to go on to the third argument now, where we continue to rebuild our material. What we say is that criminalizing disproportionately demonizes minorities. Two layers of analysis underneath this. Historically, and then also why this stops international and domestic reconciliations. Historical analysis. I'm going to interrogate what actually happens when historically states have criminalized something in the past in the context of them having power, because they do not do enough work on the word of criminalizing, which is very important in today's motion. We say that people in power get to determine what quote-unquote could, under their side of the house, actually incite hatred, because they're in systemic positions of power. We say that speech is objectively good, and I'll take you in a second. Speech is objectively good because it causes things like discourse, but when we put that power in the hands of people who have their biases, we allow them to use that to create a subjective interpretation of speech. Go.
Your feasibility arguments don't make sense because we clearly tell you about an international committee that will act as an equalizer. More importantly, tell you about your alternative.
Okay, I understand this, but the point at which your only response is there's an international community that's going to do this, and I give you 4 pieces of material, all of which Millen tell you, we said you're not engaging. We're saying the point at which a reasonable person cannot look to your model and understand what the side of their house looks like, that's not them meeting their burdens. That's not them proposing the motion. As I was saying, speech is objectively good, but then when we give it to these people, they interpret it with their subjective opinions. Why is this bad? One, it absolves governments of their responsibility to actually fix the problem, because they say, oh, I've criminalized something, therefore, I'm absolved of the ability to fix the systems that actually cause the need to criminalize it in the first place. Second, this re-entrenches the power of hegemonic states which already use for example, white people in the United States as a means of inciting power. We have a couple examples to back this up. First, Saddam Hussein, when he was using chemical warfare against the Kurds, he imprisoned lots and lots of people who actually spoke out against that under the grounds of their inciting instability or hatred within the government. We say that the converse of that is that he did not throw into prison the people who were supporting his regime, because he was imprisoning these people people under the guise of like actually repressing their speech. Secondly, we say look to the United States, look to the war on drugs, for example, where in the 70s we criminalized drugs, and by doing that, we saw that people in society who were already viewed as being criminal because they would have like a system that was designed against them in the first place, were actually imprisoned more, disproportionately more, because we allowed the state to decide how this was enforced. We say that crack and cocaine crimes actually were arbitrary in that in suburban areas that had more white populations, people could get 6 months, or in urban areas it was 10. Now, the institutional long-term effect of this ceding of power of criminalizing based off arbitrary means has resulted in 1 in 3 black men in the United States going to prison disproportionately more than white people. Why is this bad? It entrenches the oppressive power structures we're talking about, and also it creates a tangible harm in the short term. The second piece of analysis is why this stops reconciliations. We say that post-tragedy, we use speech as a means of talking about awful, hate-inducing instances and topics to promote understanding. Look to the Truth and Reconciliation Committees in post-apartheid South Africa, where people who were suffering at the hands of the Afrikaans were actually able to sit down and have discussion about this. This prevented future violence. That's the world of the opposition. The world of the proposition is instances like Lebanon, for example, where there are civil wars between Christians and Muslims, but because they could not talk about these things and have this discourse, we see that now there's 30 years of violence into the future. What we say is you have to look to the comparative. The point at which their model changes between the first and the second, and I anticipate it probably is going to change again in the third, we say they're not approving their burden. Secondly, we tell you that they're not actually evaluating the way in which governments use their already social power to enact violence on people that they dislike. The point at which they cede the power of the enforcement in this motion to those governments, speech is no longer objective, it becomes subjective, and the enforcement of it becomes arbitrary. Thank you.
Here.
Thank you for your speech list. The speaking time were 8 minutes and 24 seconds.
Ready? Just before we move on, I'd like to say that speakers have 15 seconds when they're offering a point of information, in which time the floor is theirs, so you can't just wave them down and make them sit down in that time. If they exceed that time, I will tell them to sit down. Otherwise, let them finish their points, please.
Alright, it's now my pleasure to call the third speaker of the proposition to give his speech.
They may have a lot of fancy rhetoric telling you that anything can be held as a hate crime, anything can be talked about inciting hate, right? But the POI, which they conveniently shut down before it was over, talked about the fact that they have no alternative whatsoever, even though they admit to the fact that hate still exists in society, ladies and gentlemen. They are willing to accept the fact that hate exists. They are willing to accept the fact that hate harms certain individuals disproportionately in instances in society, and they're still not willing to engage in a world where state bias does not exist, ladies and gentlemen. They're willing to only engage in a world where they conveniently shape in their own utopia, or which will conveniently allow them to take the case in which we don't engage. But ladies and gentlemen, understand how we go to their world and show you that even in a scenario where the state bias is there, we tell you that there are international committees which actively cater to this problem. They will continue to make you believe, ladies and gentlemen, that they have been sufficiently responsive towards the idea of the jury. And that's where we move on to the rebuttals, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, our model is still intact and still gives us the principal win in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, because they failed to characterize how a jury consisting of every single individual, the disabled, the members of the LGBT community, members of religion, members of religious sects such as the Catholics and the Protestants and the Anglicans, we still don't understand how, besides that, when we have an international tribunal there to equalize the state bias, ladies and gentlemen, to equalize any whatsoever rhetoric that incites racism or incites any form of bias. We don't understand how that's still not equalized, no thank you. In that point in time, ladies and gentlemen, they lose the debate because our model still equalizes every other harm that they talk about. Their harms of how there will be a bias, we tell you that the debate is not about those states where the system is inherently ruined, but even if we go to their world, ladies and gentlemen, the international tribunal, the jury, equalizes the state bias. Moreover, they talk about how anything can be characterized as hate speech, and that will systematically ruin our model. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that isn't essentially the case, because the world has reached a point in time where there are constant narratives of how it's okay to allow individuals to perform their own religion, how it's okay to allow religious freedom as long as there is no third-party harm. So we don't understand which world they come from to tell us that a man praying will probably be perceived as something that is being insightful of hate, ladies and gentlemen. We don't essentially think we'll be putting those sorts of biased individuals in the jury, and the jury in itself is the best equalizer effect. We hear no other alternative from them, and therefore our model is still strong enough. But moreover, the second speaker talks about how the states could conveniently use this to propagate their own agendas, and how it's important that hate speeches exist in times of war, in times of reconciliation. We tell you that under their world, ladies and gentlemen, this is far worse. Because understand that in a world where hate speech exists as a rhetoric to act as a reconciliatory approach, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you reconciliation doesn't essentially happen. Where any sort of incitement of hate is counteracted, the entire process of reconciliation, effective reconciliation doesn't happen, sustainable reconciliation never happens. But how is that better under our world, ladies and gentlemen? Because first, we prevent states from doing that actively. But second, we bring down and create discourse within people in the higher social strata and people in the lower social strata. We create discourse in every form of social strata about why these hate incitements are objectively wrong. They tell you that there is no mechanism to decide whether there is any form of way to objectively decide, and we'll take that in our clash, ladies and gentlemen. So we have three major clashes which will decide eventually how Team Bangladesh takes this debate home. First, is it possible to create a metric of deciding what inciting hate means? This will clarify a lot of confusions if this debate happens, and this will clarify the debate from this being a very messy debate. Second, whether in principle they deserve to get punished, and these people who incite hate deserve to get punished. And third, whether freedom of speech outweighs all other rights for individuals to exist in this society. But before that, yeah.
A Sunni and Shia Muslim in your world don't even want to sit in the same room in your international community, let alone agree on what is hatred.
That is exactly why we have multiple individuals all over the world. We have an international precedent which allows the concept of actions being taken, but then we allow individuals to take part in discourse. Under your world, they don't take part in discourse because they don't come together. But under our world, when we force them to come together in a room, when we force them to sit in conference tables, when we tell them about the greater good, there's a greater probability, right? No one's over responses in their world, how that becomes better, right? So they can't only talk about harms without actively giving us comparatives on how their world is better. So the first clash, no thank you. Is it possible to create a metric of deciding what inciting hate means, ladies and gentlemen? So this actively relates back to our model once again, where we prove to you that, ladies and gentlemen, a metric is there because we have reached a point where there's a global narrative which is easy to tell people who are rational. So in a world where you bring rational individuals together, where you make active attempts of inciting rationality rather than inciting hate, we tell you that's a far better world to live in. Moreover, we tell you that when you go on to create an active metric of objective hate incitements, ladies and gentlemen, you close down a lot of avenues which incite hate. We're still good in a sense where we are still better in more than the status quo. In a world where there are active hate incitements and people do nothing about it because they're not even sure. But under our world, we at least have a metric. We at least have individuals discussing about the metric, and there are constant improvisations on the metric every single day, when every single issues are constantly dissected on a case-by-case basis, on a circumstantial basis. That's what allows development. We're not telling you that we'll solve all issues overnight, but we're telling you that this allows better progression of society, hence we can create a metric. Second class, ladies and gentlemen, whether in principle they deserve to get punished. My first speaker tells you about three categories. They conveniently choose to only engage in intent. First, we tell you about the intent, which can be decided, ladies and gentlemen, because you can understand the concept of rhetoric. We can understand why Donald Trump is talking about Mexicans and building walls and how Muslims are terrorists, because he wants to use that hate to incite people to vote for him, because he knows that that hate can bring people together in voting for him. So that's when you know that there are hate speeches, and that's when you know that there's an intent. His intent, regardless of whatever that is, there's an intent which directly is associated with hate. As a result, you can directly understand that that is an incitement of hate in itself, and you can take actions on the basis of that. But second, when your acts directly conform to hate, we talk about the cases of Charlie Hebdo, a hugely controversial issue, ladies and gentlemen, but in a scenario where Muslims were actively disenfranchised, where Muslims in France were made to feel like they don't belong, where Muslims in France were forced to live a life that they did not want to live. We tell you those sorts of acts harm an individual beyond objective harm, and therefore it's very tough to decide that objective harm, but our model acts as a form of reparation towards them. But finally, we think this is a criminal offense because in many countries we're taking the rhetoric of how this is principally wrong. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, the freedom of speech and whether it outweighs all other rights of individuals. We tell you that the society works in a form of interaction. When one individual's interaction causes another individual to be harmed in any ways whatsoever, we think that's wrong. But why is this criminally a crime? Why is this a criminal offense, ladies and gentlemen? Because we understand that this makes individuals feel like they are not a part of society. This is an interaction which in reciprocity can lead to further perpetual cycles of harm. So we tell you, in a world where you allow the freedom of speech to exist like they tell you with no other alternatives, you live in a far worse world because it outweighs all your rights. It makes you feel like you don't belong. Moreover, it creates a situation of violence where hate can be legitimized for any other act. We tell you we don't want to live in that world. To change is necessary, hence stand with Team Bangladesh.
Thank you for your speech. The speaking time were 8 minutes and 20 seconds. It's now my pleasure to ask Amit to give the speech.
I'm genuinely confused in this round. Because at the point where a Sunni and a Shia can't sit in the same room with each other, how are they going to work together on an international committee to figure out what could promote hate? See, the problem with side proposition's world, which we have significantly simply casted doubt upon, is your world is a utopia in which everyone in the world comes together in a room and figures out what is hate, right? So it seems like a Catholic man who his whole life has understood that homosexuality is wrong, but then a trans person comes in and changes that view, you just assume that will be determined objectively and everything will be okay. We think we were expecting a little bit more layers of deep logical analysis that aren't as simplistic as simply things are bad and people will agree on it. And that's why we're winning this debate. First, I'm going to be going over their major argument, the only thing they can win on, which is that hate still exists in our world. Then I'll be going over the burdens. Finally, I'll be asking two questions, which is one, does criminalization affect everyone? Because usually it only affects the minorities. They seem to happily forget about that. Second, can anything be objective? Here's their biggest argument. In our world, hate still exists and we do nothing about it. We've given you two answers that they aren't responding to. One, you make things worse. We gave you layers about backlash and criminalization that I'll get into further, but these are layers of analysis that look to history that determine when we criminalize something, what actually happens and who is actually affected. Which means if they make things worse, they have a bad world. Second, our alternative is the ability for minorities to fight up. Which means if we win that nothing can be objective and Black Lives Matter protests or trans protests are now somehow hate crimes, you stop this in your world. Here's the bottom line. If someone always hates someone, that's never going to change. The question is, can we promote discourse and different protests that are allowed to have other perspectives in the views and not monopolize one perspective as always being true? That's what they fundamentally miss. That's why they're not winning this debate round. Couple burdens we set to them before I go into main issues of clash. One, I don't think the motion committee would make a motion that says hate speech is bad, because I'm pretty sure that they would win as soon as they got the draw for being prop. The reason it could promote hatred is where the clash lies in this debate. So when they say a Muslim man praying is considered hate, and we reject side United States for thinking that, we say no. There's people in the world that could promote that as hate. And that's the distinction, which is a very subtle distinction, that they don't want to talk about in any of their speeches and characterize this as bad. Next, they have to defend the effects of criminalization. When we criminalize something, there's specific effects to that. If we show their effects are bad, that's a reason they make things worse in their world. Go ahead.
So in the United Nations Council, we have a lot of countries who have internal tensions between them. Do we prevent them from taking part in discussions?
No, discussions are fine, but in a world in which you want to have an international president, that means like the entire planet Earth has one way of determining what is hate based on all these people coming into a room together, we think that's simplistic, we think that's a utopia, and we think that just simplifies the way in which hate speech is constructed, that simplifies the way religions are constructed and the way people see things. First question, does criminalization affect everyone? So first, I want to extend a couple responses, 4 to be exact, that we had on their international courts model that they didn't respond to. One, an individual state decides what is illegal or legal. So even if an international state sets a precedent, the government still has to enforce it. 2, they're not talking about conflicting views. We brought this down the bench that if there's conflicting views in a world, how do you determine what is objectively true? That means if there's a conflict, which is the third response, there's no mechanism to determine what is hate speech or what is not because of that existing conflicts that they don't answer. Fourth, we gave you the idea about governmental bias. We believe that we live in a world in which governments are uniquely biased to specific identities within their nations. Even if, on their highest layer, their international committee is the utopia they talk about, the government still has to enforce it. So if esteemed panel, if you think any government around the world is corrupt, like, oh, I don't know, the United States, in which we say criminalize drugs because drugs are objectively bad, but subjectively certain racialized people look like the ones we want to criminalize, and that results in disproportionate criminalization, we think all around the world that's what's going to be happening in their world. Go.
So, for once, stop engaging on feasibility, engage on principle of why this will be wrong if it works perfectly.
Sure, principle. You say the principle is that we should determine that anything that can promote hatred is bad. We say the one flaw in your principle is that the freedom of speech is objectively good because it creates discourse. However, in your world, you taint the freedom of speech by saying some people should get to determine what other people should be able to speak freely. We say, you know the people that are going to determine what is free and objective? The ones that are in power. Even all these international people they're talking about, they may be liberal in their views, but they still have power. And you're not answering that fundamental question that if some people are able to determine, that's fundamentally problematic. We gave you a couple examples. Saddam Hussein, when people spoke up against his chemical warfare, they were in prison. Why? Because they were speaking their opinion. They could have spoken their opinion to engage in things like protest, like the real freedom of speech. Your side of the world would stop that because he was the one in power, he was the one that gets to determine, even if your international community makes sense. Second, we gave you an idea about reconciliation. This was layers of analysis that was not responded to in the last speech. We said, post-apartheid in South Africa, the way to reconcile what had just happened is to go through the hateful things that had been said. Meaning, people had to speak hateful things to understand the hateful crime that had happened. In your world, this reconciliation process, or even the process of Black Lives Matter criticizing Detroit, doesn't happen in your world because it could produce hate. And let's talk about that POI for a second. We think on a principle level that POI was absurd. Because if you are criticizing a specific identity, in this case, white people that have systematically oppressed other people, and I want to say a generalization like I think all white people might have a bias towards me, in your world, that's hate speech. Why? Because someone on that international committee is going to be white, and that doesn't fly with them. They don't want those generalizations about them. So in your world, those generalizations are exactly what stops the objectivity from being objective and creates the subjective world. We think what protests are happening are fine, and we will let them continue. Second question, can anything be objective? No. I'll say it again. No. Nothing can be objective in this world because there's different perspectives. The comparison of worlds is very clear. In their world, they allow the subjective views to try to make things objective, which results in more backlash, more criminalization, and a more concealment of views. In our world, which is the status quo, we make things comparatively better because we say minorities should also have the equal right to talk just like someone in power. That's the entire principle behind free speech that they haven't interacted on. Second, they say their jury is built upon international precedents. We think that jury will also be subjective, and if that jury is allowed to be told what is right or wrong, that results in worse harm in their side of the world. So, this debate was very simple. Team Bangladesh missed the distinction between hate speech and could promote hatred, which is a very simple distinction. Because their utopia cannot account for things that are objectively bad. Their utopia is never going to actually make that correct. We think, one, they make things worse with backlash and criminalization. You conceal views and you only target specific people because those who are hegemonic identities won't be criminalized. Second, our alternative is for minorities to be able to fight back without their objective views being considered subjectively bad. Bottom line, if anyone on our esteemed panel believes that some people will misinterpret the views of protesters, misinterpret the legitimate views of those who are marginalized, that's why their world is bad, that's why they'll over-criminalize, that's why they'll make things worse.
Thank you, Amit, for your speech. The speaking time was 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Now the time has come for the reply speeches. Let me just quickly remind you that those speeches are only half as long as the previous ones, so 4 minutes, and there are no points of information allowed during those speeches. Side opposition will start with the reply speeches with Miller. Please welcome him.
The thesis of the opposition's case was very simple. What I hate is different than what you hate. No objective standard, no international tribunal can account for this difference. It's something intrinsic to the fact that we all have different biases, we all have different opinions, and that's why side proposition's approach to today's debate was awfully simplistic. Because the motion wasn't hate speech is bad. That would be an absurd burden to place on the opposition. It's should we criminalize anything that could promote hatred. Because they didn't engage with that motion, they lost today's round. 2 questions in this reply. Firstly, on the comparative world. Secondly, on the principle, which we saw a woeful lack of engagement on. But first, one strategic error by Team Bangladesh. This international committee, even if we suspend all belief and assume everyone can get in a room together and work together, it still doesn't function because necessarily, as they said, it has equal representation from every group, from every mindset, from every culture. What does this mean? This means that this committee will never ever come to an agreement because someone who's hyper-Catholic will never agree with someone who says, go gays, right? This means that this community is going to be perpetually paralyzed because there's no way to break this tie between opinions, no way to actually determine what objectively incites hatred, even if we believe this occurs. At the end of the third speech, however, they give us this new argument, right? That promoting discourse is good, right? That's why an international committee could work. At that point, just have an international committee to talk. Don't have one that criminalizes this kind of thing, right? We don't think that's exclusive to the proposition world. We think that's not engaging with the model. First question on the comparative. They say that hatred exists in both worlds, right? At that point, it's a question of who best mitigates that kind of hatred. We say there's a marginal utility to people of disenfranchised identities having the opportunity to protest, right? If we think that Black Lives Matter protesters are going to be considered as inciting hatred by a white supremacist community, but by the converse, white supremacist members can also have hate speech, which world is more useful? One without speech at all, or one with hate speech from both, potentially? We think that a world in which minorities can protest is the better world because if there's no protesters, those minority communities can never actually gain equality. In their world, the hegemonic identities are the only ones that remain because there's no discourse at all. Then we talk to you about reconciliation. Because what we said is that in the process of reconciliation, in countries like South Africa with apartheid, you often have to say the hateful things that happen in the regime to actually get past it. No engagement from the proposition. But But then, let's assume that we're just looking at criminalization, right? We said criminalization, even in a world with an international committee, is still enforced by governments, right? And these governments always make subjective determinations about what ought to be criminalized based upon their own biases. This is why Saddam Hussein can say, oh, these protesters were inciting violence, promoting hatred, even though they were just fighting against a corrupt regime. We think that when they don't analyze the intricacies of criminalization, the key term in today's motion, and how they function in the real world, they're not actively engaging with us. But the fifth argument, even if you suspend every matter of belief and think they can only target hatred, is backlash. Because if these individuals can't talk about their backlash in public, they're going to vote for the candidates who best disenfranchise people without speaking hate. They're going to plot in secret without talking in public and only reify their harmful views. That's the kind of backlash we talk about. Secondly, on the principle. What we said was very simple. Speech is objectively good, but it's subjectively bad when we allow the people in power to criminalize, to determine what kind of speech could promote hatred. That was the burden on them, and that's what they never showed you was a justified violation of free speech. Because they had to show you that there was some rational basis for us to violate this thing to know to be an intrinsic human dignity, an intrinsic human good. We say that anything that could promote hatred, which is what they had to argue, is not sufficient grounds to violate and defeat our principled stance. This ground was simple. Although the motion and the model given by Bangladesh muddied it, what I hate is different than what you hate. There's no objective standard to criminalize that. That's why we oppose.
Thank you, Millen. The speaking time will have 4 minutes and 9 seconds. It is now time for Sashid to close the debate and give the proposition's reply speech. Please.
Opposition loses this debate for a simple reason. If it was impossible to find a metric to punish people, there is absolutely no government case that could win this debate. But we still tried, ladies and gentlemen. We still tried to give you a metric to which we punish people. We created the most neutral form that deals with representation. We created a local incitement of a jury that involves all kinds of people that just like normal juries do, where they talk with each other, where they walk with each other, and they look through the process of dealing with the most responsible and efficient way of characterizing a hate crime. But what is their ultimate case? They tell us that this will still lead to misrepresentation and this will still lead to an exploitation of that law. Where we clearly win this idea, and that was the majority of their case, where we clearly showed you that this happens in normalized world affairs anyway. Where when you have disputes between countries, you force countries to sit together at the UN, no matter what their differences are, and talk it out. Shias and Sunnis might have issues, but I'm pretty sure two different individuals won't have issues talking about a hate crime that involves the entire society, ladies and gentlemen, just like normal juries with people from all walks of life talk about. If their debate is going to be one on feasibility, that's a debate that they can never win, ladies and gentlemen. But even further, we think that this ensures that an engagement needs to happen on why we punish these individuals. The only response to what is the punishment is that it's exploitative. People in echelons of power are exploitative, the state tends to exploit. We've given you constant reminders that this in general does not happen. First, because of the system we've implemented, which completely disregards the state and the kinds of people the state has power over, and includes the minorities, ladies and gentlemen, includes people from all walks of life and involves them in the discussion. But secondly, what's the comparative in this debate? We are at least stopping all these incitements. We're creating the most fair system to stop all these incitements. In their world, what happens? Minorities can't really voice themselves out. They're always overshadowed by the hate generated for them. If their argument is that we allow minorities to fight because of hate speech, we've continuously shown to you that that never happens because that overshadows their ability to talk. They're always overshadowed and they're always secluded. My first speaker showed the harms that this has on these individuals for which they never really speak out. But ultimately, that was the extent of the engagement on feasibility. But that's never what the debate should be judged on. Because if it is, in a lot of cases, we'll probably not win because we can't characterize a proper metric, even though we did in this debate. What we do in this debate on absolutely is a principle and a utility, ladies and gentlemen. We clearly clarified a principle of criminalization of these individuals. First, we characterize intent. We characterize the kinds of intent that happens. Their best response to this was, look, intent is subjective. People praying might incite hate. It's pretty simple, ladies and gentlemen. Donald Trump incites hate, he's not punished. In our world, he's punished. There's a rational metric for everything to be punished, ladies and gentlemen. They don't win that on that example. But also, they never engage on our greater societal utility. Their only response to this was, look, post-reconciliation societies need this hate to get over it. In certain cases, freedom of speech is important because it allows people the expression and discourse. We continuously showed to you from our case that if that discourse is not meaningful, it never really creates a positive net benefit. Something that they clearly fail to show in their world, where this discourse is always negative, it's always exclusionary, it's always targeting those individuals. They never responded to this. But we clearly gave to you examples of how the world changes in our side. The status quo is these people are hated on. The process is that we create a jury that makes the most fair call on what a hate crime or an installation of hate crime is, and that is decided. But the outcome of this is a society that is unique and tolerant, something that they absolutely did not engage with. The backlash, ladies and gentlemen, sure, it restricts people from expressing hate, but that allows all these victims, all these individuals to come out into society, express themselves, be a part of the country, feel like they're a part of the country, not engage, and not put themselves in ghettos where they have absolutely no rights whatsoever. Team Bangladesh clearly wins this debate.
Thank you, Sajid, for your speech. The speaking time was 4 minutes and 19 seconds. The judges will now complete their mark sheets, they can retire from the room, and then after a few minutes.
Okay, so just two things for everyone in the room. First of all, can we just get a round of applause for our chairperson? She's doing a very good job. And the judges will stay in this room, so could everyone else please leave? It'll be roughly 20 to 30